integrity for Swimming Australia, as well as their sort of head of people and culture. And about 18 months ago, I started my own consulting business, and I've been working with Cricket Victoria since then, and to sport more generally, particularly in child safeguarding, as well as people and culture and sport integrity more generally too. We've just released some resources that I'm very excited about, and congratulations to the team. Today is really all about the practical aspects of child safeguarding, and they go a large way to helping make this an area that we're more comfortable with, I think. So I'm looking forward to the session today. And as Ben said, the best sessions like this are the interactive ones. And what I'd like to do before we get into it is really ask a question of you all that all of you can answer. And I would ask that you please type your responses to these 2 questions into the chat box. So let's get into it. The first question is really, why cricket? So what's the best thing about being involved in cricket? And I'd ask you to type your answers in the chat box, and Josh is going to read them out for me, given I've got a presentation view. Let me know, Josh, when you get some answers through.
Yeah, Brooks raised friendships.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, friendships is it's fun.
The social aspect, fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Family.
Yeah.
Community.
Connections is coming through as a theme. Yeah.
Yeah, team environments.
Yeah.
Meeting new people. Social aspect.
Yeah. So a lot of connection and fun answers there. Thank you, everyone, for your answers. Can we flick to what's the worst thing? What's the hardest thing about being involved in cricket? Can you share your answers with us in the chat box again, please? How are we going, Josh?
Still getting some positives. There's admin and parents, the organisation, politics.
Admin, parents. I'm interested in why parents.
Volunteer
Politics.
burden.
And that's probably the why parents, I'm assuming. Yeah. Volunteer burn. Yeah, there's a lot to do in cricket. And child safeguarding is part of that too. Any other sort of answers coming through, Josh? There's some indicative ones already.
Yeah, they were the key points there. Overloading volunteers here, coming through very loud clear at the end.
There's a lot to do, and most of us are volunteers, and at times that makes it tough. And I think if we come back to why we are in cricket, it's that fun and connection aspect. We love the sport because it provides us with so much in our lives. So we're in cricket because we love it, and we also want others to participate in it and share that love of the sport. We want it to grow and we want it to thrive. And I think people, and kids in particular, will only love the sport and come back to the sport if they feel welcome, if they feel included, are having fun, and they feel safe. So why am I asking these questions? It's because we've got an audience here. You're on the front line, and it's really important to remember your own personal connection to cricket, as well as to know the answer to why child safeguarding is important. If you truly love your sport and you want people to come back, then this is one of the most important things, if not the most important thing we can do in cricket. So you need to be able to answer that question to the people who may be questioning why this is an important issue in child safeguarding. Often child safety only becomes an issue when it becomes when something's happened and it becomes too late by then. So we don't want this to happen in your clubs and in your region. And in the context we're in too, there's a lot to do, and there's also a lot that's been going on over the past few years for us in sport too. We've had the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses into Child Sexual Abuse, where Queensland Cricket was before that commission. And then on the left-hand side here, you can see the myriad of things that have been coming up in terms of USA Gymnastics in particular. The Larry Nassar case was just extraordinary. We've just seen the Netflix series Athlete A released, and that's led to gymnastics in Australia, New Zealand and the UK also having inquiries into their culture. We've had the Time's Up and Me Too campaign, and you know, all this context. When I ask people how they feel about this, The answers I often get are I feel a bit overwhelmed and uncertain because I'm not sure what I can do and what I can say anymore. It's very political, as came through in your answers. So that, it makes it tricky for us. So then, for those of you who have had some involvement with child safety in Victoria in particular, we've had the 7 standards that have been part of our mandatory requirement in Victoria since the 1st of January 2017. And we've just started to get to know these, and now we have a set of 10 national principles for child safe organisations too, which are slightly different. They are not inconsistent with the Victorian standards, but it's an area, I guess, that is growing and developing. And generally speaking, in our community, there is a lot more awareness of what is appropriate and inappropriate conduct. So, we need to keep in mind these great things about our sport and come back to them, because the sort of outcome we're looking for is really something that I found. This is an actual letter that I received from an amateur athlete to a coach a couple of years back, and it says, I want to say thank you. The older I get, I've realised that there were some pretty big moments in my life growing up where it actually had a good lasting impact on me, and for some of it you wouldn't even know. You encouraged me. And I think if we can get back to that as how we're encouraging children and really drawing them and their parents back into cricket, or encouraging them to keep playing cricket and drawing new people to the sport, that's what we want. We want it to grow, we want it to thrive, and that is what it's all about. People need to feel safe and welcome and included and encouraged. So let's just outline what we're going to cover today in terms of our objectives. 3 things today, and the first one is understanding why child safeguarding is important. And I hope that first 5 minutes is actually provided just some personal insight for you into why this is important, and your personal connection to it. So the good news is we've already covered that one off. The second is knowing what it is that we all have to do in this area. And I'd like to try and simplify some of the policy requirements we've got under the Australian cricket framework. And finally, it's understanding how we can make cricket safe and create that culture of child safety that is part of the Victorian 7 standards. And that's really looking at what are the practical actions that clubs can take to make sure that you're thinking about child safety and talking about it. It becomes part of your language and part of your habits as a club. So along the way, we'll answer your questions. As mentioned at the start, if we do find we've got more questions that we can answer in the session, we're going to be putting together a frequently asked question document. So rest assured that everything will be answered, if not in the session today. So what I'd like to do now is get into the second objective there, which is really what is it that we all have to do in this area. So, and I want to start by just outlining, getting 3 main things under this heading. People tend to remember things in 3s, so that's one of my ways of helping us remember things. So first of all, we want to cover cricket's child safety framework, what it is and what it does. Then we'll go into understanding the key concepts and practices to which that framework refers. So that's child abuse, grooming and harm, the recruitment and screening practices, the code of behaviour and child safe officers. And then finally, it's where you access that help, and the new resources that were just released yesterday are a big part of that as well. So this will be the content heavy part of the session, and if you've got questions, please type them in the chat box and Josh will try to capture them along the way. Okay, so cricket's child safety framework. This is a slide with a number of boxes. Down the left-hand side there, again, 3 things, 3 components in the main to the framework, and they are the commitment to safeguarding children and young people, the policy for safeguarding children and young people, and that's really the sort of nuts and bolts as to what we have to do, and then also the code of behaviour that we'll cover in this section as well. So with those 3 elements, what Australian Cricket has done and Cricket Victoria has assisted with since 2018 is really an action plan. So That action plan has a number of tools within it, including a checklist, some recruitment induction and screening, a whole bunch of things that are in that central box there. And then also we've found that in terms of implementing the child safety framework within clubs, there's a checklist that was produced that is all about endorsing and adopting the key documents, promoting it, appointing a child safe officer, undertaking recruitment and screening, and updating forms, which is definitely part of what needs to be done. What I'd like to suggest, though, is, as I mentioned, to create a real culture of child safety where we are talking about it and doing things slightly differently to potentially what we have done in the past. That takes time, and it's probably more involved than that. So I'd suggest that this is really a baseline, and today what we're going to talk about is really the how you create a culture of child safety, as well as doing the things that we know that we have to do, and we'll simplify those things in this section as well. But certainly the intent of the Australian Cricket Framework is absolutely to create a safe, fair and inclusive environment, and we'll cover that today. And we've complemented that in particular with some tools to simplify some of the requirements, because we've also spoken to the cricket community and you've told us that that would really help you. So we're really confident that what we've produced will be of great assistance to you. Now, this really helps you in terms of what it does, because we need to know what the boundaries are for us, pardon the pun. As I mentioned, there is a much greater level of awareness in general society today about child safeguarding standards and what's acceptable practices, and that's because of all the things that have occurred before on that previous slide. So you guys need to know what is considered acceptable and unacceptable, and that's to protect kids, but it's also to protect yourself. So in terms of what the actual framework does, it addresses what we now know are the environmental factors that contribute to child abuse. So we know that in-person abuse, 80% of the times, it's actually people that kids know and trust, rather than the previous belief of a sort of serial perpetrator who was just doing that. It's really those trusted relationships that people can take advantage of if they have the opportunity to do so. And what this framework does is address some of the risk factors, the environmental factors that can create that environment for abuse to happen. It does provide the clear standards of behaviour and clear procedures for dealing with complaints. It provides some guidance and tools, and it reflects best practice in safeguarding children. And as I mentioned, importantly, it helps kids, but it helps you as well. Now, what does it require of all of us? First of all, we need to understand that kids have a right to feel safe, and they need to have a voice. So we need to also empower them to give them a voice in our clubs. And that tends to be something that has only been a focus more recently. We need to understand the definitions, indicators and impact of child abuse, including grooming. We need to follow the code of behaviour, it goes without saying. Not harm or exploit kids. Ensure that we invoke the recruitment and screening processes, that we act on concerns, and that we know and follow the relevant laws as they relate to reporting child abuse. So let's get into making sure that we can cover that all off for you today. And before we do so, I just need to caution that child abuse is a sensitive and difficult topic. We can relate situations to our own families or experiences or those of people that are close to us. So I just ask that please be aware of how you're feeling throughout this, and if you need to take a break, please do so. And I know you'll also be sensitive to others who potentially may share their experiences, and I've certainly had a number of sessions in which that's occurred. Righto. Any questions, Josh, before we move on?
There's been one from Marcus, who's just asked about an online training course for safeguarding children, a course on safeguarding children and young people for coaches. I'll just send through a link now to the Play by the Rules online education module, which is a fantastic resource. And then Stephen's also asked what checks are undertaken to make sure that clubs are doing all the checks and not just saying that, John Smith, you can be the child safe officer this year. So just appointing people to certain roles.
Terrific. And we'll actually be covering recruitment and screening as part of this section too. So we'll try and focus on that when we get to those sections. Thanks, everyone. All right. So understanding the definitions, indicators and impact of child abuse. Let's go to that now. Under the Australian Cricket Framework, child abuse is the mistreatment of a child or young person that has harmed, is harming, or is likely to harm or endanger the child or young person's physical or emotional health, safety, development, or well-being. And I think that the main point of this is that it's a really broad definition. It includes the words likely to harm, which means that harm doesn't actually need to have occurred. So there can be a situation where you're concerned about the potential of child abuse occurring, and that's something that would need to be potentially addressed in the most appropriate way in responding to those concerns. Now, there are a number of types of child abuse, and they are really on this slide as well: physical, sexual, emotional, or psychological. So that's bullying, and we've heard a number of claims more recently in the gymnastics context about that. Neglect, which is a tough one because often that happens in the home, as does family violence, obviously. And then there's grooming and sexual exploitation as well. And there are a number of indicators of child abuse occurring as well. So they can be things like, for physical child abuse, we see bruises, we see scratches, but then there's behavioural indicators as well, such as acting up, withdrawing, hiding devices. So given that some grooming and emotional abuse can happen electronically these days, it could be that someone's hiding their phone or their iPad or laptop and spending a lot of time alone. I think the biggest thing that we need to be aware of as administrators in cricket and sport more generally is there a change of behaviour that we're noticing in children? Are they doing the opposite of what they might normally be doing? And if so, the question to ask is why. So if we're feeling that something is not right, our gut instinct will usually be there for a reason. So that's not necessarily to say, right, that person's behaviour has changed, they must be being abused, I must report it. But what are the discrete questions that we may be able to ask of either the child or others within our community to just make sure that everything's okay? So change of behaviour is the biggest one in terms of the indicators of child abuse. Now, the definition talks about harm to children, and I'd like to explore that a little bit more now. So the definition of harm to a child is any detrimental effect to the child's physical, psychological, emotional well-being. And again, this is a very, very broad definition, and it is immaterial how the harm is caused, and it can be caused by any one or more of the things listed on this slide. So that's those physical, psychological, emotional abuse, neglect, sexual abuse or exploitation. And I think here too, it can be a single act, omission or circumstance, but it can also be a series or combination of acts, omissions or circumstances as well. And that's an important one because just the smallest things that don't feel right can often be the ones that you think, oh, it's only a small thing, I don't need to be concerned about that, or I don't need to let someone know. But it could be part of a greater pattern of circumstances that when you put all those things together that different people are noticing, actually does indicate that there is a real concern in someone's behaviour and the impact that that behaviour may be having on a child in a sport. So it's really important to make sure that we're aware of all those things. The other thing I would say too, this is the Australian Cricket definition of harm. And as on the ground, field staff, we're the administrators of the game, we also have a role to play in being practical about what we do, act on, and For this definition in particular, there's no threshold of significance here. Now, what I would suggest is that if harm to a child is going to be reported, that it needs to be significant. And that's because otherwise we may get into situations where children harm each other. There may be a scratch or a bruise or a push or something like that. And the definition of harm doesn't specify adults causing harm to children. There can be a number of reasons why harm to a child would happen, but it's not necessarily something that we would act on. So I'd go back to what are the reasons for our concerns and what's the appropriate response. If it has the potential to lead to significant harm for a child, then of course we would want to be taking steps to make sure that the right people knew about what's happening. Josh, am I sensing a question there?
Great timing on the discussing the significance of harm. There was just a question around sledging players and that are children, and then how does that fit with emotional and psychological harm? And I think you answered that perfectly there with the understanding the significant element of harm, and then potentially trying to understand is that sledging crossing a line, breaching a code of behaviour.
Yeah, and look, it's a really fascinating one that we could spend a whole at least hour on the culture of a sport and that impact and where it has the potential to cross over to impacting someone in a detrimental way. We have a code of behaviour for dealing with children in sport, and we're going to cover that shortly. So, a lot of the time too, there's an impact element to what we should be acting on, and people will experience things in different ways. But certainly when it comes to kids, we should be taking an encouraging stance with them. Our language and tone of voice has got to be positive, and that's set down very clearly and explicitly in the Australian Cricket Code of Behaviour, which as I mentioned, we'll cover specifically shortly. Okay, now I just want to cover grooming as well. Now, this is something that Victoria as a state has been leading on for a number of years. I think 2016 was when we got legislation to introduce grooming as a criminal offence. And grooming is really the behaviours used by a perpetrator to build a relationship with a child or young person with a view to abusing them at some stage. So with grooming, what happens? There are two main elements. Adults would build a trusting relationship with a child, and sometimes their carer, so their parent or carer as well. But then once that trust is built, the person may isolate the child to abuse him or her. So they will find situations where they've got the opportunity or the environment to get away with abuse. And that's that isolation aspect where they're not necessarily in the company of other people. So it's graduating from lower level behaviour, attention giving and non-sexual touching as some examples, to increasingly intimate and intrusive behaviours. Special relationships and spending time alone with children could be an indicator of grooming. So it's something that, again, I said before, if we're not conscious of the lower level concerns that we're feeling and making sure that we're acting on those concerns in an appropriate way, things can escalate. So that's why that broader picture is really important. I'm going to move on to recruitment and screening there. Then now, Josh, just checking on questions.
No more questions at the moment.
All good. Terrific. So this will come back to some of the checks that we've got to undertake in cricket. What we've found is, in terms of what we've learnt, particularly through the Royal Commission, and I use the example, I think it was Ridsdale, who moved around from various schools and centres over his time in the church, and that has been a pattern of behaviour that we've found that those who sexually abuse children can certainly undertake. So we have recruitment and screening processes to make sure we can mitigate the risk of missing some of the indicators of why people in any industry, any sport, may have left roles and why they're seeking to relocate into new areas. So the recruitment and screening procedures are really about advertising roles, making sure there is a clear statement as to what Cricket Victoria is all about and what's important to it, making sure that there's an opportunity for at least one face-to-face or video interview. In Victoria, we're clearly not doing a lot of face-to-face at the moment, but the video interviews will be a fantastic reference point as well, and I've been recruiting a number of people online. We need to be conducting reference checks, and there are some resources that we've developed with a number of questions that we can request of people to referees from their previous employment, call those people and check in about things such as why that person might have left their previous place of employment. Inductions, so online training courses are really important to make sure that people understand their obligations, and Play by the Rules is the current mandated course from the Australian Cricket Framework. And courses like this will no doubt be used to be much more specific to Cricket Victoria's requirements under the Australian Cricket Framework. It's important that we make sure that people understand what the boundaries are and what's important to Cricket Victoria and all of our associations and clubs. We need to cite the proof of identity or proof of qualification documents. They can get lost in the fog at times, but is someone who they say they are. Maintain records of those things on file. And of course, make sure that working with children checks are in place in Victoria, making sure that either an application is in progress or that you have a current working with children check, preferably before you start, is critical, and each club would maintain a register of those checks and be making sure that the child safety officer in particular, with making sure that you're working with children checks are current and that there are regular sort of audit points to check in about those things. So questions, there's usually a couple of questions in terms of the screening processes there. I believe, Josh, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it is a relatively manual process, which most sports are at the moment. There are online systems to automatically check with the Victorian body as to the currency of working with children checks every 7 days, but most clubs will do that manually. So, Josh, any questions that we'd like to address at this point in time?
No extra questions.
Okay, fantastic. Well, then we'll move into the code of behaviour now as well. And this is, I think, probably one of the biggest changes. And we've mentioned some of these things already. The standards are higher than they have been before. There will be things in here that may be new to some people that have been in the sport for longer periods of time. And sometimes it's the hardest area, because what this requires sometimes, if it is different to what we've been used to doing, is changing habits. And that takes time in itself. It takes a number of I guess, attempts to be doing things differently to really ingrain it as part of your new ways of behaving. So logistically and practically, there may be some challenges that we need to recognise and face into. And I think the biggest one that I've come across in my time in running these sorts of workshops is just, are people aware that these these behavioural standards are in place now? Sometimes people aren't, and it's simply a matter of saying, look, I'm not sure if you're aware of the code of behaviour, but it does state that we've got to be positive. We've got to use language and a tone of voice that is appropriate for kids and that encourages. And they will be variations of that theme. Again, our role is to be taking a really pragmatic approach to this. The more competitive kids get, there's going to be probably an edgier tone and a bit of sledging in cricket. We all know it exists, but how far does it go? And there's no hard and fast line, and often it does go into the words that are said and the impact that it has on people. But certainly from our positions, We need to be the role models. We need to be positive in our language and our tone of voice, encouraging kids as much as possible, remembering that they want to feel safe, they want to have fun. Yes, there's definitely a role for competition as well, but you can be a competitor. You won't want to keep being a competitor if you're not feeling safe. Now, the second one on this slide is adhering to role boundaries. And generally what this means is that if you're a coach, you're only a coach. So you're not acting in any other role, such as a masseur or a physio. And particularly too these days with so many ways to contact kids, I think it's you're not a friend. And this is harder, I know, in regional areas where a lot of the communities know each other and we are friends. But when you step into that role as part of your club, your role is your cricket club role. And it's important to make sure that you're adhering to the boundaries that we set in Australian cricket and not overstepping them as you are in that role at that time. And I think the challenge here for all of us is if there's any doubt, don't do it. Because there is, as I mentioned, a lot more awareness of what the appropriate standards are these days. And to protect yourself, it's just better to be safe than sorry. So act as in an official capacity rather than in your friendship capacity. And it might be that you need to say, look, I'm putting my cricket coach hat on here, and explaining that means you need to be taking on a different way of interacting with kids than you would if you were having dinner with the family, for example. So that can be a tricky one, and I acknowledge that, yet it's really important. And supervision in particular as well, we've talked about the opportunity for those that abuse, because 80% of those that abuse kids are people they know in person. Online, it's quite the opposite. So at all times you try to be within the eyesight of other people in cricket. You're never alone with children and young people. So that means you're not transporting children in cars too. And this is one that in particular schools are red hot on in Victoria. You're not to be in any situation whatsoever that is unsupervised. And again, I think the stance we've taken in sport is probably less hardline than we have in our schools, because there's been a recognition that sometimes these situations are unavoidable. What this framework is saying is that best practice, the safest way, is to always have people that can see you or that are with you. Okay, so try not to be alone with children. If there is a situation in which a child may be in danger, if they are left alone, then we wouldn't want to be in that situation. And there are steps that we can take to make sure that you're letting other people know that you're in this particular situation, that you're contacting the parents, you're contacting someone from the club. And if there is a situation where you need to be alone with a child, you've got permission where possible. So, but best practice would be just try not to put yourself in situations where you're alone with a child when you're in that official capacity, as you know, a coach or an administrator, whatever your role is within cricket. Use of electronic communication. So this is really always copy and a parent and keep messages appropriate, and always about cricket too. So again, these aren't personal messages. You can't befriend children through Facebook, through Instagram, through those various online apps that we've got if you're in an official role. It's just better not to be going down that path in this day and age, because that's where a lot of abuse and grooming in particular can start. So copy and use TeamApp. That's a common and very good app that's used more widely in sport as well, and make sure that your messages are going out to parents and kids and they're about cricket. Now, physical contact must be also appropriate and be connected to cricket. It might be a batting technique where you need to place your hand on a child's arm, let them know beforehand that you want to demonstrate this technique, and you'll be placing your hand on their arm and checking that that's okay. That's the simple way to sort of do things, and there shouldn't really be any other ways that you are having physical contact. Of course, if you're in a situation where medical attention was needed, if a child needed comforting, and you're not in an unsupervised situation, all that stuff too. Again, we need to be pragmatic about this. But the main message here is physical contact being appropriate and about cricket. Goes without saying that sexual misconduct is just not on. And then change room arrangements too. So again, supervision needs to be appropriate in change rooms. And we've had quite a few instances in sport too that involve mobile phones in change rooms. So where possible, if your club doesn't already have a no mobile phones sign, that's a really good one to implement, because that avoids some of the situations we've had where kids will be playing up a bit in the change room. They might take a photo, and that photo ends up in someone's inbox without any encouragement, and can lead to a bit of a sticky situation for those of us who are in sport and having to deal with that. I've mentioned transporting children. So if you're giving a child a lift to training, make sure that you've got the transport form that we've got in Australian cricket. And I know that that's produced a few issues, and I think that was being looked at, Josh, by Cricket Australia in particular. Can you provide an update on where that's at, please?
Yeah, and we've just had Graham ask a question that he's with the club that's out of town, and they often have to have senior players take kids home after training. If they don't pick up and drop off these kids, they won't have a side. So yeah, the transportation and pick up approval form is still there. There's for where you know that there's going to be, I guess, a year long or for an extended period of time, and you need standing permission to have that pick up and drop off approved. There is an element of that form which can be done for a whole season, for example. But we understand that there's instances where you don't know who's going to be taking that person, that child. So there is the opportunity just to contact the club, have the parents send an email, a text message to a club official that can be stored, that just gives that approval, so that it's protecting the child, but it's also protecting those people that are picking up and dropping off the children, just so that there was approval there to take the child, and there's records of that.
Beauty. Thanks, Josh. Now I better move on. Alcohol and drugs too, and overnight stays. Overnight stays shouldn't happen unless Cricket Victoria has approved them, and certainly alcohol and drugs is a no in terms of being under the influence when in the presence of kids in cricket. Righto. Now, I guess, again, if you're questioning your behaviour or the behaviour of another person, please just ask, how might it look or seem to others? And particularly if they don't know what your situation is or your relationship, you might be someone's uncle and they have no idea, but you're wearing a cricket uniform and it seems strange to them. So ask yourself, what don't you know? What don't you understand about the facts that you're witnessing? And then ask others for their opinion if you're at all unsure. And if in doubt, just don't do it, particularly when it comes to kids in cricket. And that's because people's intention can be different to what people perceive. So we may not know that the person we're concerned about has got parental permission, for example, to drive a child to training. So it's just checking in and making sure that if we have concerns, that everything is in check and okay. Now, child safe officers are a big part of the Australian Cricket Framework as well. And what that says is that every club should have one. It is the first point of contact for child safety matters. Those child safety officers have the role to promote child safety, to attend committee meetings, and child safety should be a standing agenda item on committee meetings. And that will get us into the habit more. They will advise the committee and manager and monitor screening and working with children checks. And finally, ensure that there's reporting of issues appropriately as well. So if you don't already have a child safety officer, the position description is within the Australian Cricket Framework and on Cricket Victoria's website. And it's a really important role for the club too. And that's a lot of content in terms of what, but the great news is that, as Josh has sent out to everyone, we've got a number of resources that will help to simplify processes and procedures. So we're going to talk in the next section about responding to resources, and you can see there the flow chart in terms of managing child safety concerns and the steps that we can undertake. I really encourage you to have a look at those resources that summarise the key points that I've just gone over there, over in that section for you. Now, just a brief pause to check in, Josh, before I move on to the final part of the session. All good to go?
There's just a couple of additional continual comments about, it's difficult to get people on committees, and, let alone having them to do the child safe officer role, and a bit about the documentation. So I guess a bit of the theme of the volunteer burden. I think it's probably important that we sort of reference some of the earlier webinars we've done about volunteer recruitment and retention. It's obviously important that we have a wide group of people that are looking to support and create child safe environments and implementing these practices. So I'd really encourage that you try to involve as many people as possible, and I guess just to reinforce with the transportation forms, and there is a lot of forms that throughout this, but where there is more practical steps, such as sending a text message or an email about transportation, you are fine to use those sort of methods.
Yeah, and it's really just try and be as practical as you can. I guess what you're hearing here in this session is some interpretation too, to make sure that there is significant harm. You don't need to be worried about every potential issue or concern. Taking those pragmatic steps if some of the code of behaviour things aren't possible. Make sure that you do take the best possible path that you can, because the thing to remember here is, there's more to do, without question. What's the alternative? If something happens, it would be devastating. It would be devastating for the child involved. It would be devastating for people in your club. And as someone that has seen things occur and managed issues like that, it's just awful. So the alternative is just unfathomable, and the extra time that it may take is well worth it. Okay, now we're going to go into the final section here, and this is really some tips as to how your clubs can create a culture of child safety. And these are these practical tips we were talking about before. Whilst you're all leaders in cricket, my motto is that you can lead from every position. It does help in terms of having your public-facing leaders on board as to why this is important. So going back to why you want to raise the importance of child safety, it's because it will grow the club. It will produce more revenue potentially. It'll, stick it up the next club because you've got more members of them. Whatever it is, whatever appeals to your leaders, safety of children and young people will lead to more participation, will lead to the outcomes that your leaders are keen for you to achieve. So there are 7 steps that Vic Sport have recommended, and I really like these ones in terms of sharing the load a little bit too, and some of the themes that have come out of this. Form a working group. It doesn't come down to one person. It shouldn't come down to one person. Every single person in the club has a role. And if we're running awareness workshops, if we're making sure that we're talking about this, it will become normalised. So that working group can start to spread the word. It can involve leadership. Those leaders are then spreading the message for you and supporting the message as well. So that's, I think, the most critical aspect. We've got to have the right people involved, and they've got to understand the why that we talked about right at the beginning. We've got to review the current policies and conduct that risk assessment so the environmental risks are mitigated and there's less opportunity for abuse to occur. Identify those gaps and get the further information to help. Cricket Victoria has now got so much for you. Involve children. Ask them where they feel safe or unsafe. Ask them how they think the club can do better. They're very, very insightful. And then just draft an action plan. You've got the policies and the templates there for you, and set up those leadership practices, such as having a standing agenda item, making sure, what are we doing about child safety for this month? What's our goal for this season? Whatever that might be. But the more we talk about it, the more it normalises it. You've got the Australian cricket checklist there as well, which I said is the baseline. And then we've got other practical tips that I'll run through now in terms of empowerment, e-safety, responding to concerns, and reporting concerns as well. So there's your checklist that we've got there. This is the Vic Sport Getting Started website as well, and there's a lot more detail if you are just starting out that I would recommend you access through the Vic Sport website as well. And then in terms of empowering children and young people too, I think this has been one that sport's been getting its head around, what are the key requirements, and we're starting to turn our mind more to involving children in child safety. And the Commissioner for Children and Young People have a number of resources that are well worth taking the time to read too, if you're potentially in a child safety officer role, and you're encouraging your club to be doing more in the child safety area. These tip sheets are terrific, and there's a fantastic guide there as well. The other one is the call to action in Cricket Victoria too, and that's see something, say something. Of course, being respectful and appropriate, making sure that we're being discreet in terms of concerns, but we want kids to say something and feel like they can say something and they know who to go to for help, and it's just someone they trust. It doesn't necessarily need to be the child safety officer, but we need to be reiterating to kids that if they have concerns, it's okay to speak up. And we've got a kids guide that's got some key messages in there. We want to give that what we're providing to kids to our parents as well. So have a look at the parent guide, have a look at the kids guide too. Now, the other thing we've created is some e-safety guides, and we've got a number of streams within them. So there's tips for kids, there's tips for parents, and there's tips for clubs. And they include these sorts of tips on this slide, such as education, ongoing communication, consent and supervision. So making sure that if you're running online sessions, that you've got parents who are supervising, that you've got the right filters within your club's online systems, that you can access the resources that you need to and respond to and report actual or potential risks of online harm to children. Now, a lot's come out in COVID about e-safety, and it's a good thing, because I know I talked about 80% of perpetrators of physical child abuse or abuse in the physical world as being people that kids know. In the online world, it's actually the opposite. 80% of people that kids don't know, and there are some frightening examples of someone registering on Instagram or TikTok, which is the #1 app for sexual abuse by online predators, by the way. So e-safety is one that has gotten trickier for us, but one that, again, is just too important to ignore. So I'm really pleased that we've got for you the e-safety guides in place now. I'd like to just finish off with talking about responding to concerns and reporting. So in terms of acting to safeguard each other, if you do receive a complaint or hear of an issue, just please talk to the person who is raising the issue with you calmly and without judgment or opinion, and preferably without the sort of body language and the facial expressions that would indicate that you just don't believe what they're saying. Ensure that your conversation is occurring in a private and safe environment, and ask non-leading questions to establish what the concerns are. The easiest way I found to remember this is really the who, what, when, where, why, and what next. And the what next is important because then you're targeting what they do want to occur next, not to say that what someone raising a concern wants is possible. For example, if you're raising serious child abuse and the person doesn't want anyone else to know, that's not something that you can reassure them that will occur. It's a matter then of reassuring the person that they've done the right thing by raising that concern, and that it will need to be addressed, and you'll need to tell someone who is in a more senior position than you. Now, the who includes contact details when we're talking about kids of parents or guardians or carers. And then if appropriate, if it's a lower level issue, one of those ones that we talked about that might lead to a big picture, then are there steps that you can take to resolve the complaint at that time? Are there questions you can raise? Are there things that can be done? The earlier we solve these problems, the less they snowball and become bigger issues at a later date. And if you can't, or you're just not sure what to do, then I can't stress enough, you are not investigators, you are not experts, and you don't need to be experts. It's just a matter of knowing what to do next, and that is seeking out a more senior person in cricket, a child safety officer or a member protection information officer, and just tell them what you know. You don't need to shoulder this all yourselves. And then reporting child abuse, sexual misconduct or serious criminal conduct to police, Cricket Victoria, DHS and the Commission for Children and Young People. And that's a mouthful. And I'm again pleased to say that there is a mandatory reporting resource as part of the suite of Cricket Victoria resources that we've got. In essence, if someone is in immediate danger, call police. If there has been sexual abuse of a child under 16, it must be reported to police. And that goes for everyone, no matter what position you are in cricket. If there are serious concerns, then tell someone more senior. Cricket Victoria will need to know, and that will be dealt with through the appropriate channels. So you don't need to shoulder this all to yourself. If you have children come to you, it's really important to believe the child, become calm, supportive and reassuring. Reassure them that what has happened isn't their fault. Often when kids are abused, they are threatened, they are told that it is their fault. That's what stops them from coming forward. So concentrating on them, their feelings, them doing the right thing and explaining what you're going to do now that you've been told is really important. And it's important that you don't make promises such as keeping things secret that you just simply can't keep because of our mandatory reporting requirements. And similarly, it's one of those things where if ever you get a child, and I hope you don't, come to you with alleged abuse, just tread lightly and encourage them to tell you what they feel they can. In terms of reporting, actually I've just covered this in terms of the actual mandatory reporting. And in terms of what you report, it's disclosures of actual harm, but going back to the definition of harm, there is the potential risk of significant harm as well, or exploitation or abuse. We must report if we have a concern that someone has the potential to be in the position of a significant impact to them, basically. And if there are signs or indicators, then tell someone more senior. Serious breaches of policy, sexual abuse, all those things must be reported. And all you need is a reasonable belief that it has happened or it's likely to happen. And that is a reasonable person in the same position would have formed the same belief on the same grounds. And again, we've talked about significance. So that's more than trivial or insignificant. So there's some definitions and thresholds there. So that takes us to the end of the content, and I just wanted to recap briefly on our 3 objectives and summarise those 3 areas for you. We talked about why child safeguarding is important, so you can answer that question with others in your cricket community and connect back to your personal reasons as well. We've talked about what it is we have to do in this area, as well as how we can make cricket safe and create that culture of child safety individually, what we can do, as well as what your clubs can do as well. And we've answered some questions along the way. Now, for each of those areas, the why is all about, again, our personal experience. We want others to love it. We want to grow participation. Kids will only keep playing if they feel safe and their parents trust that their child is safe. People do understand more these days as to what behaviour is acceptable or unacceptable. So we need to focus on this, because a person's perception of your behaviour can be different to what the other person intended. They need to know what we can and can't do, and awareness is growing. So this protects you. that's the why. In terms of the what, understanding the rights of children, empowering them, giving them a voice, screening people, understanding those definitions and indicators that we've talked through today, not harming or exploiting kids, following the code of behaviour, acting on concerns and reporting child abuse. Again, all things we've covered today. And then there are the practical steps that your club can take to create that culture of child safety. And they're summarised here. So on that note, I will hand over right on time back to Ben, I think, or Josh. Yep, and I'd like to just thank you for your time today and encourage you all to just do the best you can possibly do in this area. That's what we ask.
Thanks so much, Laura. That's a fantastic and thorough presentation. And I really like the way you've just closed it out there with just doing our best. And as Josh has sort of alluded to as well, trying to create a culture of child safety at our clubs is what we intend to do. So thanks so much, Laura, for your time in presenting today. I appreciate and acknowledge this can obviously be an overwhelming topic for clubs and volunteers, but it's really pleasing to see 60 clubs today recognising that it's a really important topic and wanting to learn more about how they can ensure their clubs are safe and welcoming place to play. So the next couple of slides just go through the Cricket Victoria staff if you're not familiar with them. But we've got the community cricket team and as I've introduced at the start, the North and West Country team there that are available to support you. The high performance guys, Shane Coop is our North and West Country person that you need to be familiar with. The member services department that we've got based in head office, we're trying to play a greater role in supporting association and club management. And this club development webinar series is an example of that intent. So we're trying to get more resourcing and more support out there, acknowledging that we do have that volunteer burden and it's really difficult to find people to put up their hand for leadership roles at the club. Just to touch on the future webinars, so we've got 2 further future webinars coming up. We've got school to club transition with a focus on Woolworths Cricket Blast, as well as growing girls cricket. So please promote those within your club and local area. Last point I wanted to make is a difficult one, but it's looking through the registrations for these webinars. I'm seeing a lot of people here today that have attended all of the webinars actually, and many that have attended 2 or 3 so far. I applaud you guys and girls for your efforts in doing that. It's fantastic to see you guys regularly attending. But I suppose I just want to try and encourage you to try and find people within your club that can share the load a little bit, and we can sort of spread the load on these things. It's unfair to expect one person from a club to be across everything from child safety to COVID return to play to raising revenue to volunteer recruitment. So as I say, I appreciate that's potentially a touchy subject and it's difficult to find volunteers, but I think that's the future. If we can try and find more people to take on smaller roles and have different people responsible for different things within clubs, hopefully that can help spread the burden on you guys and help create stronger clubs. So that's all from me. As Josh has said, we will share the presentation and we will there'll be a video available of this presentation, as well as a copy of the slides and links to the resources on the Cricket Victoria website. So acknowledging we've gone a couple of minutes over time there, just wanted to thank everyone again for dialing in, and thanks so much, Laura, for taking us through the presentation.
Pleasure. Thanks very much, Ben and Josh, and all the best, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.